Hi guys, this is Mrs. Foy, and this is a little screencast on matter, its properties, and change. And so, as you learned in middle school, matter is anything that has mass and takes up space. And as we'll see, it's actually made of tiny particles. We can talk about matter being made up of or having a composition of particles. And sometimes those particles are called molecules, and sometimes those particles are called atoms, depending on whether it's a pure substance or whether it's an element. We'll talk about that later. And properties of matter would be distinguishing characteristics, like the properties of a banana are that it is yellow and squishy and can brown. So we can divide properties into physical properties and chemical properties. A physical property is something that doesn't change what the object is. For example, an apple is red on the outside and white on the inside. It is sweet. It has a certain density. Those are all physical properties of an apple. A chemical property tells you what kind of changes the matter can undergo. So a chemical property of an apple is that if you let it sit out too long in the air, it will turn brown. And that's a chemical property. So some other physical properties of matter would be how hard it is. So hardness is something that is a physical property. We know that diamond is the hardest material and talc is some of the softest. What the freezing point and boiling points of materials are, that's a physical property. Whether it can conduct heat or electricity. So for example, we know that copper can conduct electricity and plastic can't. And so that's why we put plastic coating around wires. We know that aluminum is a very good conductor of heat, which is why we make our pots and pans out of aluminum. And we can also talk about physical properties about whether or not something has the ability to dissolve in other substances. So for example, sand does not dissolve in water, but sugar does. So for example, a physical property of something like copper, this is a picture of copper, might be the density of copper, which is 8.92 grams per mil or grams per cubic centimeter. Its melting point is a super high 1085 degrees Celsius. And copper is malleable, which means it's bendable, and it's ductile, which means you can draw it into a wire. Some chemical properties of copper is that it can react with water to form a green copper carbonate material. So for example, the Statue of Liberty is made of copper, and as it reacts with, it's not solid copper, but it has a copper film around it about the size of 2 pennies thick. And it has reacted with the water in the atmosphere, and now it's that lovely green color. So that is a chemical property of copper. So chemical properties describe how something undergoes in a chemical reaction. So for example, is it flammable? Does it react with certain things? Like for example, copper reacting with water. Is it combustible? That means, is it going to create an exothermic reaction? So we have different states of matter, and states of matter are solid, liquid, gas, and plasma. Plasma is a ionized gas, like what the sun is. And we know that going from a solid to a liquid and a liquid to a gas or to plasma, if we add heat and go this way, we're making the molecules or the particles move faster, and so they get farther apart. And if we take away heat, if the temperature decreases, then we can freeze or condense materials. And this states of matter, this change in a state is a physical change. So for example, if you have liquid water, so these are water molecules that are closer together, that's a liquid molecule. If you add heat, those molecules start to move and they get further apart and it turns into a gas. But do you see how it's still H2O? And so that's why it's a physical change. It's not a chemical change. So some examples of physical changes would be going from a liquid to a solid to a gas, boiling, freezing, condensing. All those things are physical changes. Cutting, painting, folding, tearing, making a solution, blending up something in a blender. Those are all examples of physical changes. But in a chemical change, new matter is formed. So there is a chemical reaction that occurs in chemical change, and the material is no longer the same substance. So this is an example of burning or rusting when iron reacts with oxygen in the air. When you cook an egg, it's a chemical change. You can't take a boiled egg and make it cold again, and then it turns back to a runny egg anymore. Film processing, when you develop a film, those are all examples of chemical change. And as we're going to see in lab, you have evidence of chemical change by the following 4 things. It's very important to know these. When there is a chemical change, you will see a formation of gas, little bubbles, or you might see a change in color, or you might see a precipitate form. So that's going to be a solid that forms in a liquid. It looks cloudy. There's little tiny particles, or a smell is produced. So those are all examples of chemical change, and I hope that's been helpful, and I will see you in class.